They say you never know when a single moment will change everything. 1 second, I was lost in my morning run, and the next, I was on the ground, tangled with a stranger who made my heart race in a way I hadn't felt in years. It should have been nothing. A fleeting moment in a city full of them. But I couldn't let it go. And maybe I should have. They say Los Angeles is a city of endless possibilities, where anything can happen if you're in the right place at the right time. I never paid much attention to those words, even though I had spent my entire life here. But some days, the city had a way of throwing surprises at me when I least expected them. My morning routine had been the same for years, ever since before Daniel passed. Every day, I laced up my sneakers, slipped into my usual workout gear, and headed out before dawn. Running through Griffith Park before the city fully woke up gave me a sense of calm, a rare moment where I could clear my head before the day took over. That morning was no different, at least, that's what I thought. The air was crisp with the lingering chill of the night, and the world around me was still painted in shades of soft grey. I moved without thinking, my feet pounding the familiar trail in rhythm, lost in the same looping thoughts I always had. The list of things I needed to do, the memories I wished I could set aside but never quite managed to. I was so deep in my own world that I almost didn't notice the presence moving toward me. Almost. The impact happened in an instant. A flash of movement in my peripheral vision. The jarring collision of bodies. A sharp gasp, mine or his, I couldn't tell. Before I knew it, I was sprawled on the gravel path, my breath knocked clean out of me. For a moment, I couldn't process anything other than the warmth beneath me, the solid frame I had landed against. I blinked, struggling to find my breath, and that's when I finally saw him. He was young, mid to late 20s, maybe, and the kind of fit that only came from relentless dedication to the gym. His features were sharp, strong jaw, dark eyes, an expression of equal parts surprise and amusement. My mind, still scrambling to catch up with reality, barely registered that I was practically draped over him, his hands instinctively steadying me. I didn't move. Not right away. For the first time in years, I was close, physically close, to someone, and it unsettled me in ways I didn't expect. His scent surrounded me, something crisp and warm with the faintest hint of spice. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it filling my ears, drowning out everything else. Slowly, I pulled away, my hands tingling from where they had been pressed against his chest. Heat flushed through me, embarrassment creeping in as I realized how ridiculous I must have looked. By the time I found my footing, he was already standing, brushing off his clothes, still looking at me with that same expression of mild amusement. That was when I noticed it, my tank top had twisted in the fall, revealing far more than I intended. I froze. And he noticed at the exact same moment. His gaze flickered downward before snapping away just as fast, a flicker of awkwardness crossing his face. He looked anywhere but at me, clearing his throat as he gestured vaguely. I swallowed hard, quickly fixing my top, my face burning. For a second, neither of us spoke. The absurdity of it all settled in slowly. A woman like me, a little past her prime, knocking over a man who probably spent his days training like an athlete. The thought almost made me laugh, though I could barely muster anything beyond sheer mortification. Finally, I exhaled, attempting to brush off the last of my embarrassment. By then, the moment had passed. The city was beginning to wake up, the sound of distant traffic filtering through the trees. I took one last look at him, wondering if I should say something more, but I didn't. Instead, I simply turned back toward the path and kept running, willing myself not to look back. Yet, even as my feet carried me forward, my mind refused to let it go. Because for the first time in a long, long time, something in me felt awake that I told myself it was nothing. A random moment in a city full of strangers. A fleeting interaction that shouldn't have meant anything. But for some reason, I couldn't shake it. The next morning, I went back to Griffith Park at the same time, running the same path, telling myself it was just part of my usual routine. Just another day. But deep down, I knew better. I was looking for him. I scanned the faces of early joggers, dog walkers, and the occasional group of tourists who had found their way to the trails. But he wasn't there. My heart sank a little, though I wasn't sure why. What did I expect? That he'd be waiting for me. That we'd bump into each other again like some ridiculous scene in a movie. Still, I came back the next day. And the next. For a full week, I ran that same stretch of the park, pretending not to care while my eyes searched the crowd. I hated how ridiculous I felt, how foolish this made me. A grown woman, well past the days of reckless infatuation, hoping to catch a glimpse of a stranger. By Friday, I was cursing myself. Who was I kidding? A guy like that was probably busy with his life, work, friends, maybe a girlfriend. He wasn't wandering around Griffith Park hoping to collide with some woman who had practically flattened him to the ground. I tried to let it go. Tried to convince myself it was nothing. But the feeling didn't fade. By Saturday, I was finally ready to put the whole thing behind me. It was time to stop acting like a lovesick teenager. I went about my morning as usual, stopping at my favorite cafe after my run. As I stood in line, waiting for my coffee, I mentally scolded myself for being so foolish. And then I saw him. He was across the street, near the park entrance, stretching one leg over a bench. The early sunlight cast long shadows behind him, highlighting the sharp definition of his frame. His back flexed as he moved, the fabric of his shirt clinging just enough to remind me of exactly how solid he had felt beneath me when we fell. I froze. The barista called my name, pushing my coffee toward me, but I barely heard it. My feet moved before my brain could catch up, and suddenly, I was outside, crossing the street, heart hammering in my chest. He was still there. I took a deep breath, willing myself to act normal, casual, like this wasn't something I had secretly been hoping for all week. "Hey," I said, my voice coming out too bright, too eager. He straightened up, turning toward me, mild surprise flickering across his face before shifting into recognition. "Oh, hey," he said, flashing that same easy smile. "Didn't expect to see you here." I let out a small laugh, trying to ignore the way my stomach fluttered. "Yeah, well, I guess I'm predictable." His smile widened. "Nothing wrong with that." I wanted to say something else, to keep the conversation going, but suddenly, I had no idea what. What was I doing? What was I even hoping to accomplish? I scrambled for something, anything. "I just wanted to apologize again," I blurted out. "I think I practically ran you over last week." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't worry about it. I've had worse tumbles." I smirked. "Glad to know I wasn't your most traumatic accident." He laughed at that, the sound warm and genuine. For a moment, we just stood there, smiling at each other, and something about it felt easy, natural. Like we weren't just two strangers who had crashed into each other on a jogging path. I hesitated, debating whether to ask for his name, whether it would be too much. But before I could stop myself, the words were already out. "I don't even know your name," I said, tilting my head slightly. "If I'm going to be a part of one of your stories, I should at least get that much." He grinned. "Alex. Alex." I let the name settle in my mind, rolling it around like a stone, feeling how it fit. "And you?" he asked. "Lena." He repeated it once, almost as if testing it. "Lena," he said, his voice lighter, amused. "Nice to meet you, Lena." I nodded, feeling the strangest urge to keep talking, to keep this moment going for just a little longer. But the rational part of me reminded me that this was nothing. Just a casual conversation. Just a stranger I happened to meet in the park. So I forced a smile and took a step back. "Well, I won't keep you from your routine," I said lightly. "Thanks again for not holding my clumsiness against me." Alex shrugged. "No problem at all. And hey, maybe I'll see you around." "Maybe." I nodded, turned, and walked away. As I did, I told myself to let it go. To stop overthinking. To stop looking for meaning in things that didn't have any. But later that evening, as I stood in my kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring a pot on the stove, I caught myself replaying every second of that conversation. His voice. His laugh. The way he had looked at me when he said my name. And I knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't over. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm, already restless. I told myself I wasn't thinking about Alex, that I wasn't hoping to run into him again. But the extra second I spent tying my hair back just right, the way I smoothed out my tank top before heading out, it all betrayed me. The park felt the same as always, the air still cool from the night, the paths just beginning to fill with early risers. But my mind wasn't on the scenery. I was looking for him. And then, there he was. Near the same bench as before, stretching, his muscles flexing under his fitted shirt, completely unaware of my presence. My stomach tightened, anticipation curling in my chest. I approached with a little more confidence this time, my steps deliberate. A part of me wanted to play it cool, to act like I wasn't here for him, but I knew better. I stopped just a few feet away, watching the steady movement of his body as he warmed up. He made it look effortless. He noticed me a moment later, standing up straight, his expression shifting from mild surprise to recognition. I smiled. Easy. Natural. He greeted me warmly, his voice carrying that same familiar ease. I let my gaze linger a second longer than necessary before making a casual remark about his discipline, the way he stuck to his routine. He chuckled, brushing it off, but there was something in the way he responded that made me feel bold. Maybe too bold. I stepped in closer, testing the space between us, letting my words carry a weight they hadn't before. A harmless compliment, at least, that's how I intended it. But even as I said it, I could see the shift. His shoulders tensed just slightly, his fingers flexing at his sides. I ignored it. I made another comment, letting it hang in the air just a little too long. He laughed, but it was different this time, shorter, hollow. His gaze flickered away, not meeting mine as easily as before. Still, I pushed. A remark, laced with something more. A suggestion, light but unmistakable. Silence stretched between us. Then, the hesitation. The barely perceptible stiffening of his frame. The forced chuckle, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I knew instantly I had gone too far. The realization hit like a slap, heat creeping up my neck. I scrambled to cover my tracks, letting out a laugh, waving off my words as nothing more than a joke. But the moment had already shifted. He nodded, responding politely, but the warmth wasn't the same. His voice carried a note of careful distance, the kind people used when they didn't want to offend but needed an exit. And then he was gone, jogging off down the path without looking back. I stood there, frozen in place, the weight of my own mistake settling in. What had I been thinking? The walk home felt heavier than usual, my thoughts tangled, replaying the interaction over and over again. The easy connection we had shared was gone now, buried under my own misplaced boldness. By the time I reached my apartment, I was exhausted not from the run, but from the realization that I had ruined something before it had even begun. The next morning, I hesitated before heading out. My routine had always been simple: wake up, lace up, run. But now, there was something else tangled in it. Regret. I had pushed too far, misread the moment. I saw it in the way Alex had pulled back, how his easy warmth had faded into something guarded. It had been a mistake, and now I had two choices: walk away from it entirely or try to fix it. So I went back to the park. Not to chase him down. Not to force something that wasn't there. But to at least acknowledge what had happened. To smooth over whatever tension I had created. I spotted him just as he was finishing his run, his breathing steady, a light sheen of sweat on his skin. He looked different this time, not just physically, but in the way he carried himself, more distant, less open. I took a breath, walked up to him. He noticed me after a second, his expression unreadable. Not cold, not exactly, but not as welcoming as before. I kept my tone light, casual. Apologized for yesterday, for my words coming out the wrong way. I didn't explain further, didn't need to. He nodded, the tension in his posture easing just slightly. A small, polite smile flickered across his face. For a moment, I considered leaving it at that. Walking away before I made things worse. But then, before I could stop myself, I asked if he wanted to grab a coffee. Just something simple. No expectations. A pause. A flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Then, to my surprise, a nod. We walked to a small cafe just a few blocks from the park, falling into step with each other like we had done it 1,000 times before. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't effortless either. There was something unspoken sitting between us, something I wasn't sure either of us wanted to acknowledge. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee and baked pastries filled the air. I ordered my usual, he got the same. We sat near the window, the city moving outside while we sat in a moment that felt strangely separate from it all. I didn't know what to say at first. Small talk felt pointless. So I let myself be honest. I told him I'd been alone for a long time. That after my husband died, I had spent years trying to rebuild myself, to figure out how to exist in a world that had suddenly felt so much bigger and emptier at the same time. Alex listened. Not just politely, but really listened. When I admitted that maybe I had imagined something between us that wasn't there, that maybe loneliness had made me see things differently, he didn't interrupt. He just sat there, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. And then, after a long silence, he reached across the table. Just a simple movement. His fingers barely brushed against mine, but it was enough to send a quiet pulse of warmth through my skin. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a promise. But it was something. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I wasn't sure what that meant. If it meant anything at all. But when I asked if he wanted to come back to my place for a little while, my voice softer than I intended, he didn't hesitate. He just nodded. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself hope. The walk back to my apartment was quiet. Not awkward, but heavy in a way I couldn't quite name. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe I was afraid he'd change his mind, that he'd suddenly realize this was a mistake and come up with an excuse to leave. But he didn't. He stayed by my side, matching my pace, his hands tucked into his pockets, his expression unreadable. Inside, the air felt different. Thicker. Charged. I set my keys down on the counter, turning to face him, unsure of what came next. "Do you want something to drink?" I asked, my voice softer than usual. He shook his head, his eyes still on me. There was something in them, curiosity, maybe, or hesitation. But he didn't step back. Neither did I. I moved closer, reaching out, my fingertips barely grazing his arm. He didn't pull away. And that was all I needed. The kiss started hesitant, careful, like we were both testing the boundaries of something unspoken. Then, slowly, it deepened. His hands found my waist, pulling me in, and for the first time in what felt like years, I let myself fall into someone else completely. For a little while, nothing else existed. After, we lay in silence, the room dimly lit by the soft glow from the streetlights outside. I traced small circles on his arm, my body still warm from his touch. For the first time in a long time, I felt weightless. But then, he moved. A shift, small but significant. He sat up, running a hand through his hair, his posture suddenly stiff. Something was wrong. I knew it before he even spoke. "Lena," he started, his voice careful, measured. I sat up, pulling the sheet around me. "What is it?" He sighed, shaking his head as if searching for the right words. "This was nice," he said finally, his tone too gentle, too cautious. My stomach tightened. The warmth from before drained out of me, replaced with something colder. "But," I pressed, because I knew there was more. He hesitated, then exhaled slowly. I didn't want to hurt you." The words hit like ice water. I stared at him, my mind scrambling to make sense of what he was saying. "What do you mean?" He looked away. "I could tell you've been lonely. And I didn't want to make things harder for you." I felt my chest tighten, the realization sinking in all at once. Pity. That's what this was. Not connection. Not attraction. Just a quiet, well-intentioned kindness wrapped in something that had felt too real to be fake. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. So this wasn't real? His expression softened, but that only made it worse. "Lena, you're amazing." He stopped himself, sighing again. "I don't want to lead you on." I nodded slowly, pressing my lips together to keep them from trembling. I wouldn't let him see me break. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. Then, Finally, he stood, pulling his clothes back on with quiet efficiency. I sat there, watching him, feeling like a fool. He walked to the door, hesitated just long enough to look back at me. "I'm sorry," he said. And then he was gone. The door closed behind him, leaving the room unbearably empty. I sat there for a long time, staring at the wall, letting the weight of it settle over me. I had let myself hope for too much. Let my own loneliness paint something that wasn't there. And now, I was right back where I started. Alone.